Let me tell you about a Saturday morning in March of 1994, and a room full of men in polished shoes, and one quiet fellow standing at the back in a canvas work coat with a coffee stain on the left sleeve. It's Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The sky above Christiana that morning was the pale bruised gray of early spring, the kind of sky that hasn't decided whether the winter is done with you or just resting. There was still a rim of dirty snow along the north side of the auction hall. The hall itself was an old Grange building the county had rented out for the day. Low ceiling, fluorescent tubes buzzing, folding chairs set in 9 rows facing a plywood platform at the front. And on that platform stood the auctioneer, a man named Eldon Fry, 68 years old, silver-haired, with a chest microphone voice that could sell a dead cat to a widow if the widow wasn't paying attention. The lot everybody had come for was 187 acres of what the county considered useless ground. The old Tobias Stoltzfus dairy farm, 3.5 miles north of town on Noble Road. Tobias had died the previous September at the age of 91, alone in the farmhouse he'd been born in. He had no children, no living siblings, and a will that left everything to a Mennonite charity. The charity, having no use for a broken-down dairy on marginal soil, had turned it over to the county to sell. And so that morning, folks came to bid. Now, I have to tell you who filled that room, because it matters. Near the front sat a group of men in pressed dress shirts and topcoats. Developers, landmen, suitmen we called them. Their leader was a fellow named Raymond Heiser, president of Keystone Ridge Development, out of Lancaster proper. Raymond was 57 that year, silver at the temples, wore a camel hair coat that probably cost more than my truck. He had bought up 7 farms in the corridor east of Lancaster in the previous 4 years, and turned every one of them into townhouse subdivisions or warehouse pads. Beside him sat his partners Don Mayhew and Lloyd Garber, and a real estate lawyer with a leather portfolio. They had all come for the same reason. The Stoltzfus place sat on a slight rise with good visibility from Noble Road, and Noble Road connected to Route 34, which connected to the whole east-west freight artery, quietly becoming one of the busiest logistics corridors on the East Coast. The land was garbage for farming, but for a warehouse pad it was ideal. Heiser had walked the property in October and sketched 220,000 square feet of distribution space on a legal pad. He had come to the Grange Hall expecting to leave as the new owner for somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000, the way a man expects the sun to come up. Now, in the last row of folding chairs, sat a fellow by the name of Walter Randall. He was 52 years old that morning. He had driven over from his little machine shop on Bridge Street in Christiana in a 1986 Ford F-250 pickup with a crack in the windshield and 184,000 miles on it. He was not a large man, not a tall man, not a loud man in any room he had ever entered. He wore a canvas Carhartt work coat, faded to the color of an old page, and he carried a manila envelope folded once against his chest. And inside was a cashier's check drawn on the Farmers Trust of Christiana in the amount of $47,200. That was every cent he had in the world. Walter had been a widower for 2 years. His wife Marilyn had died in the winter of 1992. Breast cancer, 16 months from diagnosis to the end, and she had checked the ledger from her hospital bed until the last 2 weeks. His son Daniel was an electrician up in Harrisburg. His daughter Catherine taught 4th grade in Reading. Walter fixed farm machinery for a living and had run the same shop for 28 years. But nobody in that Grange Hall knew any of that. And when Eldon Fry rapped his gavel at 9 o'clock, Walter sat with his hat on the chair beside him and his eyes level on the auctioneer. And here I have to take you back, because $47,200 does not appear in a country machinist's pocket by accident. It arrives by patience. And that patience came from a wound. And the wound came from Walter's father, Clifford Randall, who had milked 70 Holsteins on a 90-acre farm 2 miles south of Kirkwood from 1946 until the fall of 1972, when the milk cooperatives merged and the new hauling contracts required a bulk tank Clifford could not afford. And the bank called the note, and it was all over in 11 months. Clifford was 59 years old when he lost the farm. He worked as a hired hand on other men's places for the remaining 19 years of his life, and never once complained in Walter's hearing. But Walter had seen his father's hands, and had seen the way his father sat at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings looking out the window at nothing in particular. And Walter had understood what had been taken. He was 30 years old when he married Marilyn in 1972, the same year his father lost the ground. On the second night of their honeymoon, in a rented cabin near Cape May, Walter told his new wife that someday, when they had the money, he wanted to buy a piece of ground back. Not for the money it would make, but so his father could set foot on a farm his son owned before the old man died. Marilyn had listened and taken his hand and said one word, yes. And that was the beginning of the ledger, and the beginning of 21 years of Saturdays adding $40 and $60 and $90 to a savings account at the Farmers Trust of Christiana. And that is why, on that gray March morning in 1994, Walter Randall was sitting in the back row of a Grange hall with a cashier's check against his chest. And that is when Eldon Fry looked at his sheet and called the next lot. In 1994, the average price of a small dairy farm in Lancaster County ranged from $40,000 to $70,000 for parcels considered marginal, well below the going rate of $5,000 to $8,000 per acre for prime tillable ground. A land parcel's value at auction was driven less by soil quality than by its position along freight corridors, which had begun their sharp appreciation in the early 90s. This gap between agricultural value and commercial value created a strange market in which working farms were often sold to men who had no intention of ever farming them. Part 2. Now here's how a country land auction works when everybody thinks they know how it's going to end. The auctioneer calls the lot, states the terms, and asks for an opening bid. And then he waits, and you can feel the room settle into what it thinks the shape of the thing is going to be. Eldon Fry opened the Stoltzfus farm at $25,000. Raymond Heiser raised his numbered card from the second row. Eldon nodded and called for 30. A man behind Heiser raised at 30. Heiser raised at 32. The other man dropped out. Now from the back of the room, a canvas-sleeved arm went up, and the numbered card in Walter Randall's hand read 33. Eldon Fry paused for maybe half a second, which for an auctioneer is a very long time. His eyes went to the back of the room and stopped on Walter. Then he grinned into the microphone in a way that carried and said, "Well now, folks, looks like we got some interest from the cheap seats." And the room laughed. It was easy laughter, careless laughter, the kind that moves through a group of people who feel like they're all on the same side of a private joke. A couple of Heiser's associates turned around and looked, and one of them elbowed the man next to him, and the man snickered. Walter Randall did not look at any of them. He looked at Eldon Fry, and his card stayed up. Raymond Heiser raised his card at 35. The bidding was moving now in $1,000 increments, and this had been Heiser's plan all along. Get the momentum going and settle it in the low 40s. 36, 37, 38. Walter kept raising. He did not hurry. He did not hesitate. Each time Eldon called the next number, Walter's card came up steady and level. 40, 41, 42. Now here's what was happening in Raymond Heiser's head. He had not come expecting a fight. He had budgeted the Stoltzfus farm at $50,000 as a ceiling and figured it would settle around 45. But it was not the money bothering him now. It was the back row. It was the canvas coat. It was the man with the coffee-stained sleeve who did not look at him when the bidding went up, did not turn a head when the room laughed, and did not appear to be planning to stop. And Heiser, who was a proud man in the exact way successful developers can be proud, had begun to feel the ancient wordless irritation rich men feel when a poor man refuses to know his place. 43, 44, 45. Eldon Fry looked at Heiser. Heiser raised. 46. Eldon looked to the back. Walter's card came up. 46, 500. The room had gone quiet by now. That easy laughter had drained out of it. People in the middle rows had turned around in their folding chairs to watch. Somebody's chair scraped on the floor. Eldon Fry's voice on the microphone had gone from friendly to focused. "Do I hear 47 from the second row?" Raymond Heiser sat very still for a moment. He looked at the notepad on his lap. He looked at his partner, Don Mayhew, who gave a small shrug, the shrug of a man saying it's your call. And then Heiser turned his head, not all the way, just a quarter turn, enough to look back along the rows at Walter Randall in the back. And he smiled. It was a small smile, more with the eyes than the mouth, and he said loud enough for the back 3 rows to hear him clearly, "Friend, what does a man who fixes tractors want with a broke-down dairy farm?" The room held its breath. Walter Randall did not answer. He did not turn his head. He did not blink. His card stayed up at 46, 500. Heiser waited for an answer that did not come. Then he faced forward again and made a small dismissive gesture with his hand, the kind of gesture a man makes when he has decided that a thing is not worth his trouble anymore. and he shook his head at Eldon Fry. And Eldon Fry called for 47 and got nothing. And Eldon Fry called sold at $46,500. And the little wooden gavel came down on the plywood platform with a plain, sharp sound that Walter Randall would remember for the rest of his life. Walter stood up. He walked past the rows of folding chairs, past Raymond Heiser and Don Mayhew and Lloyd Garber, past the men in overcoats who had laughed at him 15 minutes earlier. And he walked to the cashier's table and signed the papers with a hand as steady as a stonemason's. He put his hat on. He walked out into the pale March morning, got into his old Ford, and drove home to the little house on Bridge Street where his wife had died 2 winters before. He sat at the kitchen table in his coat and wrote at the top of a fresh page in a black composition notebook the words, North Place, purchased March 12th, 1994, $46,500, cash, free, and clear. He set the pencil down. He looked out the window at the maple tree in the side yard where the buds were just beginning to swell against the gray. He was not a man given to speaking to the dead, but he said, very quietly, into the empty kitchen, "There it is, Marilyn." And what he did next was nothing. He did not walk the fields. He did not stand at the fence line. He did not try the farmhouse door. What Walter Randall did that afternoon was he sat at his kitchen table and drank a cup of black coffee and let the fact of what he owned settle into him the way weight settles into a room. 200 yards away, at my own kitchen table, I sat with my wife Marlene, and we talked about what we had watched that morning, because I had been in the 5th row of the Grange Hall with my own numbered card in my hand, and I did not yet understand what I had just seen. But that's not what this story is really about. Because the real story starts 3 years later, when the ground underneath the American dairy industry began to shift in a way only one man in that Grange Hall had seen coming. The consolidation of the American dairy industry between 1970 and 1995 reduced the number of licensed dairy farms in the United States from approximately 640,000 to under 140,000, a drop of nearly 78%. In Pennsylvania alone, more than 9,000 small dairy operations closed during that period, most of them family farms milking under 100 head. The consolidation was driven not by production failure, but by contract requirements imposed by the newly merged milk cooperatives, which favored large-scale operations able to afford bulk tanks and refrigerated hauling. Part 3. Let me tell you about the way a market turns when nobody in the room is looking. It does not turn all at once. It does not announce itself with a headline. It turns slowly, in the small choices of ordinary people in ordinary grocery stores, accumulating for years before anybody notices. And then one morning it is suddenly the shape of the whole industry. And the people who bet against it are underwater. And the people who saw it coming look like they made a lucky guess when in fact they had been reading the water for a long time. In the spring of 1994, the word organic did not appear on any milk product sold in a mainstream American grocery store. It was a fringe term. It belonged to co-ops and health food stores. Certified organic dairy in America that year was a market measured in the low tens of millions of dollars. A rounding error. By 1997, it was $300 million. By 2001, it was over $1 billion. By 2005, it was north of $2.5 billion. Every mainstream grocery chain had an organic dairy set in the cold case, and Whole Foods Market was signing exclusive supply contracts with small certified producers up and down the eastern seaboard at prices that made conventional dairymen shake their heads and laugh. And then, a little later, stop laughing. Walter Randall knew the market was going to turn. He did not know when or how large it would become. But he knew because he had spent the fall of 1988 going through his father Clifford's things after the old man died. In a tin box in a chest in the attic of the little rented apartment his father had ended his life in, Walter had found a stack of yellowed papers bound with a rubber band gone soft with age. Among those papers was a document dated April 11th, 1961, 12 pages long, typewritten on onion skin. Signed by 17 dairy farmers from Lancaster and Chester counties. It was titled Charter of the Northeast Organic Dairy Compact. It was the founding document of one of the earliest certified organic dairy cooperatives on the East Coast. In 1961, when Clifford signed as one of the 17 founding members, organic dairy was not a market. It was an idea a few Quakers and Mennonites held onto because they did not trust the chemical revolution moving through American agriculture. The compact was a handshake operation for many years, a group of families who agreed to farm without synthetic inputs and to sell to each other and to a handful of health food stores. It made no money. It attracted no notice. Clifford lost his farm 11 years later and dropped out of the compact simply because he no longer had a farm to enroll. But the charter Clifford signed had a clause on page 9, paragraph 12, that Walter read 3 times in that attic in the autumn of 1988. And then read once more, and then sat down on the dusty floorboards with his back against the trunk, and understood what he was holding. The clause stated that founding membership was permanent and attached to the land, not the family, and could be transferred with any subsequent sale of a parcel farmed by a founding member, so long as the parcel returned to certified organic agricultural use within 7 years of transfer. 17 founding members, 17 farms across 2 counties. By 1988, when Walter read the clause, the compact had grown into a working organization with a certification program and a wholesale broker in Philadelphia. By 1994, it had signed a preliminary supply agreement with Whole Foods Market and was quietly one of the most valuable memberships in specialty dairy on the East Coast. Tobias Stoltzfus had been the 9th signature on the charter, in a careful cursive hand, right above Clifford Randall's own. And that is why, when Raymond Heiser looked back over his shoulder and asked what a man who fixes tractors wanted with a broke-down dairy farm, Walter Randall did not answer. The answer was too long, and it was not the kind of answer you gave to a man in a camel haircoat who had already made up his mind about you. Walter did not activate the compact membership right away. He spent the first 2 years cleaning up the property, patching the milking parlor roof, replacing fence lines. He bought his first 15 Holstein Jersey crossheifers in the spring of 1996 from a young Amish farmer near Gap who had lost his own place to consolidation. He filed his transfer of membership that September, passed his 3-year transition inspection in the summer of 1999, and in December of that year, at the age of 57, Walter signed his first supply contract for premium certified organic whole milk at a wholesale rate 3.5 times the going rate for conventional milk. Whole Foods was the end buyer, 5-year term with automatic renewal, and I watched from 200 yards away. I watched the truck start coming down Noble Road. I watched the little farm come back to life. Walter got up at 4:30 to milk, drove down to the shop, worked on tractors until 3, and drove back to milk again at 4. 7 days a week. He did not once in my hearing mention Raymond Heiser. But I noticed. And there came a Saturday morning in October of 2001 when I was fueling my truck at the pump and a black Lincoln Town car pulled up on the other side, and out stepped Raymond Heiser. He looked across the pumps at me with a face that had aged more than 7 years, and he asked me quietly, "Hank, is that Walter Randall's farm up on Noble Road?" I said it was. He nodded once and got back in his car and sat there for a long moment before he drove away. And I want to tell you what I saw on his face, because it was not anger and it was not resentment. It was the look of a man who had just realized in the parking lot of a country gas station on a bright October morning that he had missed something important a long time ago and was not going to get another chance at it. Certified organic dairy in the United States grew from a niche category worth under $50 million in 1994 to a mainstream segment exceeding $6 billion by 2015. Founding memberships in early organic cooperatives, most of which were signed by small farmers for handshake terms in the 1960s and 70s, became some of the most valuable agricultural assets on the East Coast during the 1990s expansion, often exceeding the assessed value of the farmland itself. The men who signed those original charters generally received nothing for their foresight, because most were dead before the market caught up to them. Part 4. Now let me tell you what happened in the last years of Walter Randall's life, because this is the part that carries the weight of the rest. Walter ran the farm at what he called a proper size. He never bought more cows than he could milk himself. He never took on debt to expand. When Whole Foods pressed him to double his herd in 2003, he politely declined. When a New York specialty grocer offered him 4 times his rate for twice the volume, he thanked them and said his herd was the size his hands could reach. He kept milking until he was 73, and then he brought his son Daniel down from Harrisburg one Sunday afternoon in the spring of 2015, and they sat at the kitchen table. and Walter explained the ledger and the contracts, and the compact, and the tin box in the attic, and handed all of it to his son with no ceremony and no lecture. Daniel had not grown up wanting to be a dairyman. He wanted to be an electrician, which is what he became. But he had watched his father for 21 years, and had watched what a small farm run properly could do, and had, at some point in his 40s, decided that when the time came, he would come home. He gave notice to his contractor in the fall of 2015. He and his wife Beth sold their house in Camp Hill and moved to Christiana that January, into the farmhouse. And Walter moved into the cottage on the northeast corner. Walter helped Daniel through his first spring, and his first calving, and his first negotiation with a broker who tried, gently, to talk Daniel into expanding. Walter did not say a word until the broker had finished, and then Walter said plainly, "The farm is the size it is because that is the size it should be. You will not persuade us otherwise, but we thank you for coming." And the broker understood correctly that this was not a negotiation but an ending, and drove back to Philadelphia. In the last years of Walter's life, young farmers began to come to him. Not many, 1 or 2 a year, mostly through my station, because they would stop for gas and ask who the old fellow was on the farm at the top of the hill. They were young men trying to figure out how to start small in an industry that no longer had room for small. Walter met with all of them. He did not turn anyone away. He did not charge for his time. He would take them out to the barn, show them the tank, and the parlor, and the ledger, and answer whatever they asked. When they asked at the end what the one piece of advice they should carry away was, he would look at them with the same level plain face he had worn in the Grange Hall in 1994, and he would say what he had come to believe over 60-plus years of watching his father lose everything and watching himself refuse to. He would say, "Own what you work what you own. Anything else is somebody else's farm, you're just running for them." He never used bigger words than that. He never called it a philosophy. He said it plain and let it land. Walter Randall died in his sleep in the cottage on the night of February 3rd, 2022, at the age of 80. Daniel found him in the morning. There was no drama in it, and no long illness, because Walter had said everything he needed to say to the people who mattered in the years he had to say them. The funeral was at the Mennonite Meeting House on Sadsbury Road. Raymond Heiser did not come. He had died 4 years earlier of a heart attack in the parking lot of his own office building at 72. I went to Walter's funeral in my one good suit, sat in the back row, and I thought about a canvas coat with a coffee stain on the sleeve, and a folded envelope, and a card that came up steady from the last row of a Grange Hall on a March morning nearly 30 years earlier. Daniel spent the week after the funeral going through his father's things, slowly, with the awareness that the objects are heavier than they look. In the closet, on the top shelf, behind a stack of folded flannel shirts, he found a small tin box that had once held tea biscuits, dented on one corner. He brought it to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was the original 12-page charter of the Northeast Organic Dairy Compact, dated April 11th, 1961, still bound with the same soft rubber band Walter had found it with in 1988. On page 12, in the column of 17 signatures, Daniel found the two he was looking for. Tobias Stoltzfus, in a careful older hand, 9th from the top, and right below him, Clifford Randall, his grandfather, whom he had never really known, whose farm had been lost the year Daniel was 3, whose signature on that page had been the only thing his son had ever really inherited from him, and had turned out, in the end, to be enough. Beneath the last signature, in his father's small, neat pencil hand, Walter had added a note sometime in the last years of his life. It read simply, "Held, passed, standing." Daniel folded the charter back and put it in the tin box. He set the tin box on the kitchen shelf next to the ledger, where Beth could see it from the sink, and where the grandchildren, when they came, would ask about it. And he would tell them, in his own time, the story of a Grange Hall on a gray March morning in 1994, and a canvas coat with a coffee stain on the sleeve, and 17 signatures on a page of onion skin, and what it meant that his grandfather's name had still been there, 33 years after the farm was gone, waiting for somebody in the family to see it. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree was just beginning to bud against the pale March sky. The tank truck came up Noble Road at 4 in the afternoon, the way it had for 22 years, and Daniel went out into the yard to meet it. a hand-signed founding document from an early American organic cooperative, transferred lawfully with land title, functions in modern agricultural law as a permanent contractual asset attached to that specific parcel. Such documents, most of them drafted by lawyers in the 1950s and 60s for cooperatives whose founders never expected the market to materialize, are among the strangest legal instruments in the American countryside. Private handshakes that quietly grew into deeded rights and now sit in shoeboxes and file cabinets on small farms whose owners, in many cases, still do not know what they hold.